Alexander's last year. Reforms and plans. Ancient history by kings in general. Let's go. If you want to see bonus content, extended clips, and early reactions, head over to our Patreon.
So far in this series, we have detailed Alexander's journey from his days as a young king in Macedonia to being the king of kings of an empire that spanned from his homeland to India. In this episode, we shall examine Alexander's last journey from Pura to Babylon. This year, rather than displaying any of Alexander's military talents, would instead put the focus more on his personality and governorship. It would also throw his ongoing Persianization into the foreground again, and would culminate in one of Alexander's most devastating personal blows. One way to win popularity in today's world would be using beauty devices. Nearing the end of 325 BC, after having crossed the dangerous Gedrosian desert, Alexander allowed his men to rest a while in Pura. While there, he received reports on the performance of many of his satraps. To his anger, many of them had taken advantage of his prolonged campaign in the Indian subcontinent, becoming corrupt and disobedient.
Don't surprise me, Alexander.
Some had taken to looting local temples and tombs, and there were hundreds of cases of his men raping local women. Alexander, eager to be considered a benevolent ruler rather than a conqueror, had such men executed, satrap and rank and file alike, appointing hand-picked governors where necessary. More worryingly still, Alexander had been brought reports that back in Europe, serious divisions had begun to form between Antipater, who Alexander had left in command of the region, and Olympias and Cleopatra, Alexander's mother and sister respectively. Though Alexander could have no way of knowing it, this rift would, in the long term, prove to be disastrous for his empire. Around the same time, Alexander proclaimed his so-called dissolution decree, which ordered all mercenaries his satraps and generals hired to disband. He was likely motivated by the worry that corruption and disobedience may eventually develop into complete rebellion, but the decree would be a thorn in his side. Though many mercenaries were shipped to Greece, many were also left roaming the empire, well armed and unpaid, a problem Alexander would later have to address. Upon leaving Pura, Alexander and his army made for Camanea. According to some sources, he turned the 7-day march.
It's like the transformation from the samurai area in Japan to the modern day. You know, what you do with that class of people. So the mercenaries, what do you do if you disband them all?
Into a kind of Dionysiac celebration, his men drinking and dancing as they marched. Alexander himself dressed as Dionysus atop a makeshift chariot. Arrian, who often takes a more favorable view of Alexander, doubts the veracity of this story.
Interesting.
At the same time, Rufus, who rarely missed a chance to indulge in such anecdotes, wrote, "A mere 1,000 men, if sober, could have captured this group on its triumphal march." The truth of the tale can be debated, however the story does touch on an undebatable detail. As the campaign continued, Alexander more and more closely linked himself with the gods. Though Arrian had doubts regarding this particular episode, there were many other occasions where Alexander either dressed or styled himself as a deity. For some in his army, this was palatable or even welcomed, and his Persian subjects, who had always viewed their king as a divine being, saw no issue with it. However, the others in the army, likely the older men who had fought alongside him for years, were growing increasingly frustrated with it, a division that would soon come to a head. Alexander and his force reached Salamis, the capital of Camanea, sometime in the winter of 325. While there, Nearchus joined Alexander, successfully returning from his 60-day voyage across the Makran coast. Yet another celebration was held, with Nearchus regaling an enthralled Alexander with tales of his journey. Though this expedition had been largely exploratory, it had also served another purpose of being a training exercise. Alexander was already developing plans for his next great campaign. Nearchus's fleet managing to sustain themselves without needing an accompanying land army would be a crucial factor in these strategies. After resting in Salamis, Nearchus was once again sent out by Alexander, this time towards the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, where they would begin preparations for the next phase of Alexander's conquests. At the start of 324 BC, Alexander moved to the capital of Persis, Persagadae, where he once more decided to visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great. To Alexander's fury, he found the tomb desecrated, with Cyrus's skeleton scattered on the floor.
What, after he said you need to restore it? Like, are you taking the piss? Are you taking the piss?
Alexander had long considered Cyrus a king worthy of his respect, possibly even an outright inspiration. Outraged, Alexander had the guards of the tomb tortured for information on the perpetrator, but learnt nothing, and had the satrap of Persis, Auxenes, executed for negligence. As his replacement, Alexander appointed Perkestus, a man who had fought bravely to protect him in Mallia. He also ordered that the tomb be renovated and improved by his chief engineer, and that Cyrus's body be restored with full honours.
Yes.
The army once again moved on, heading to the old ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Here they once again celebrated with a huge drinking party. According to ancient sources, the Macedonians drank so heavily that no less than 36 men died of alcohol poisoning. The reports of such excessive drinking parties in the sources became more and more regular as Alexander's campaign progressed, particularly in the latter years. This would, in all likelihood, prove to be yet another problem, which would soon be tragic for Alexander.
Oh, how so? He's
Shortly after, Alexander marched his men to Susa, where he undertook several important administrative tasks. As mentioned earlier, Alexander's dissolution decree left many mercenaries roaming his empire and causing trouble. As with the Gordian knot, Alexander used a pragmatic solution to a complicated problem. He issued the Exile Decree, which ordered all Greek exiles, including mercenaries, to return to their home cities, except the most serious criminals. Many Greek cities protested this decree, but Alexander made it clear that Antipater had the authority to use force on any who refused to uphold it. While this did help ease the mercenary problem, Alexander also had other motives. Reports from Europe about rumors of dissent among the Greek city-states had concerned Alexander. However, by publishing this decree, Alexander ensured that the polis would have an influx of people, many of whom would have been politicians exiled by their opponents, who would owe him their loyalty thanks to being repatriated. While in Susa, Alexander once again heard reports on the performance of his satraps, executing those who had abused the citizens they were governing, replacing those that were unsatisfactory, and rewarding those who were. Around this time, Alexander carried out the famous Susa weddings. Polygamy was an accepted practice in Macedonian society, and so, despite already being married to Roxana, Alexander married once again, this time to Statera, a daughter of Darius III, while Hephaestion was wedded to another of Darius's daughters. Alexander and Hephaestion had always been close, and this marriage ensured their descendants would now be family. These marriages may also reveal that Alexander was concerned that the governing of some of his satraps had resulted in discontent among the Persian populace, and that he felt a need to strengthen his position. These were not the only marriages, however. Many of Alexander's companions, perhaps as many as 90, were married to powerful Persian women, many of whom would have been linked to the Achaemenid family, all given handsome dowries from Alexander. At the same time, 10,000 of the rank and file who had married Asiatic women were registered and given presents by the king. The marriages of Alexander, Hephaestion, and the companions all took place on the same day in a mass wedding done in the Persian style. Alexander personally paid off the debts of his soldiers, costing him approximately 20,000 talents, according to the ancient sources,
I'd imagine that's
worth as much as a staggering $28 billion today. While many were happy to have their debts paid and marriages registered, some, particularly among the companions, were less happy with being effectively forced to marry Persian women. Notably, out of all the future Diadochi of Alexander who were married on this occasion, only one, Seleucus, stayed married to their given wife. Alexander's motive for these marriages has been and is still much debated. On the one hand, some historians, such as Tarn from the 1930s, share the view of Plutarch that Alexander was attempting to unify the two people of Europe and Asia to create a kind of brotherhood of mankind. In this interpretation, Alexander hoped to set a precedent of unity.
What's the
so
other
it was essentially
option?
a humanist act. Conversely, more modern historians like Badian and Worthington view these marriages as a purely pragmatic act. Rather than hoping to create a unity of humankind, they argue that Alexander was more concerned with diluting the Persian royal bloodline so that none could proclaim himself as a Persian king. Moreover, in their views, Alexander was hoping that the unions would result in a ruling class of mixed Macedonian-Iranian people who would not be seen as foreign conquerors, making governance easier.
The first point is very strong. Reducing the bloodline of the academic empire so that no one can rise up. And then also, once again, making a new Persian, Iranian, Greek people, so it's not so much of a divide.
There's also a big question of how coerced some of these marriages were. While there may have been some among the companions and their wives who were happy with the marriage, others were likely forced into marriages. The Persian women in particular, though we have no source that gives their views, may have been none too pleased with the idea that they were being married off to men who, no matter how Alexander wished to portray things, were their conquerors.
And also, it's a completely different culture. Women had more rights in the Persian and the academic empire, right?
I see you. You haven't liked the video yet. Why not? Go on, go like it. While you're at it, you know you want to subscribe. And if you want to go to our social medias, all the links you need are in the description box down below. And you might as well head over to our Patreon as well, where you can get extra bonus content if you're enjoying this. That link's in the description box down below. But we'll get straight back into the video. Love you guys.
In conjunction with these weddings, Alexander undertook the most significant steps towards integrating more Persians into his army. Men from Arachosia, Bactria and Sogdiana were incorporated into the companions, while the royal guard and 30,000 young Persians trained in the Macedonian style were absorbed into the army. Once again, the question of Alexander's motive is debated. Some view it as another attempt to create a unity of nations, while others view it as yet another solely pragmatic step intended to form the base of a new army to replace the many men who had either died, been wounded, or were now too old to fight. Although some of Alexander's army accepted and welcomed these changes, many were frustrated. Alexander's Persianization had been a sticking point for many of his men for years, and this increase of Persians into the army pushed them to their breaking point. Alexander marched his army from Susa into Mesopotamia in the summer of 324. At the Opis River, he announced that as many as 10,000 veterans and wounded would be sent back to Greece with full pay and rich rewards. This seemed a sensible suggestion, given the army's previous mutiny at Ephesus. To Alexander's surprise, however, the men rebelled once again. Frustrated with Alexander's personal Persianization, his divine pretensions, and viewing themselves as being replaced by Persians, they demanded that he send them all home and continue with his father Zeusamon and his Persian war dances. Alexander's reaction to this was far more dramatic than at the Hephasis. Infuriated, he pointed out 13 men he considered the main agitators and had his hypaspists execute them immediately. He then harshly rebuked the men, listing Philip's achievements, his own, and what they had done for Macedonia. Arrian has Alexander saying, "The wealth of the Lydians, the treasure of the Persians, and the riches of the Indians are yours, as is the outer sea. You are satraps, generals, and captains. What have I reserved for myself after all these labors, except this purple robe and diadem? Whoever has wounds, let him strip and show them, and I will show you mine in turn. For there is no part of my body, at least on the front, free from wounds. Depart, all of you. Go back and report home that you deserted your king and went away, handing him over to the protection of foreigners. Be gone."
Be gone.
As with almost all speeches recorded in ancient sources, it is hard to discern how much of this was Arrian's creation or Alexander's actual speech.
In this case, I'm going to believe
other
this
sources,
is Alexander's
though giving
actual
slightly
speech.
different speeches, all touch on similar themes, and it is likely that Alexander truly did feel these sentiments. It is possible to view Alexander's speech as self-aggrandizing, as he
Oh, it
lauded
is.
his and his father's achievements and tried to shame the men who had helped him achieve such feats by lauding their accomplishments as his alone. However, an argument can also be made that Alexander was justified in what he was saying, even if he was rather arrogant.
He was extremely
Alexander
arrogant.
was a significant factor in the army's success, and he had suffered alongside his men and rewarded them generously. Alexander's frustration at them for not sharing his ambition is as understandable as his men's frustration with Alexander for making them feel alienated. As at the Hephaestus,
sides.
however, his words had little immediate effect on the men, and Alexander stormed into his tent, remaining there for 2 days. Rather than offering the hand of reconciliation as he had done previously, Alexander doubled down on his position. He replaced senior Macedonian officers with Persians. More Persians were inducted into the most honored units, including the companions and silver shields. Alexander's stance was clear. His vision of the new Persian Hellenic army was happening, and the men either had to put up with it or leave. Shamed, his men begged him for forgiveness, and Alexander reconciled with them tearfully.
They had no choice.
Alexander's epic speech has since been lauded as the turning point of the mutiny. But while the speech is inspiring, powerful, and beautiful, it was not what convinced the men.
Do you not think?
It was Alexander's understanding of what kind of pressure he could apply that stopped the mutiny, and crediting the speech alone with Alexander's success underestimates his cunning.
Well, we're
Hundreds
going
of
to
years
here.
later, and likely inspired by Alexander, Julius Caesar would use a similar tactic against one of his mutinying legions, dismissing them and telling them he would go on without them with similar success.
Remember that
Alexander
episode?
held a huge feast to celebrate the reconciliation, sitting the Macedonians with the Persians and offering prayers for the unity of the two people. He continued with his original plan, sending approximately 10,000 veterans and wounded back to Macedonia under the command of Craterus. The latter was ordered to replace Antipater as regent of Europe, while the aging Antipater was ordered to join Alexander with a further 10,000 reinforcements. This move would, in theory, give Alexander a reliable and trusted general in Europe, while bringing Antipater, who had been in confrontation with Olympius, closer to Alexander for him to keep an eye on. Neither of these plans, however, would come to fruition. Alexander marched to Ecbatana, where he once again held a large celebration in honor of Dionysus, with much drinking and partying. At this point, in October of 324 BC, Hephaestion developed a fever. Glaucus, his doctor, cared for him, and at first, Hephaestion appeared to be on the mend. However, one day, while feeling better, he drank a large amount of wine and fell severely ill once again. Alexander was summoned and immediately rushed to his companion's side, but by the time he got there, Hephaestion was already dead.
Died.
Hephaestion had been one of Alexander's closest friends, and the two men had known each other since boyhood, and some speculate had even been lovers. The truth in the latter claim can be debated, but it is undoubtedly true that the two men were very close. Hephaestion had fought alongside Alexander for years, mainly as the commander of his 7-man bodyguard.
Oh, he was the
and
commander
was
of the
one Alexander's
bodyguard.
most dependable subordinates.
Well, there
He was
you
often
go.
entrusted with delicate diplomatic missions, as well as his military duties, and eventually effectively became Alexander's right-hand man.
Yep. No wonder why
Hephaestion,
he was,
because of
like,
his closeness to
was
Alexander,
upset.
seems to have made many of Alexander's other commanders somewhat jealous, so it is unlikely that they were moved by his death. Alexander, on the other hand, was devastated. There are many versions of what Alexander did in the immediate aftermath. Some say that he immediately had Glaucus, Hephaestion's doctor, executed, that Alexander lay crying on Hephaestion's body throughout the night, that he decreed Hephaestion should be honored as a hero with sacrifices and more.
Why did he
Arrian,
kill
who
the...
reports many of these stories, admits he is unsure which are true and which are not. He is right to be cautious. Many historians in ancient times were moralists who viewed their subjects as moral exemplar. As a result, some may have exaggerated Alexander's grief to highlight his humanity, others to highlight his lack of restraint. Nevertheless, Arrian does say that all sources he came across agreed that Alexander refused to eat for 3 days and ordered days of public mourning and a funeral costing thousands of talents. The exact manner in which Alexander showed his grief can be disputed, but the extent of that grief cannot be.
He
was
starved
truly
himself
heartbroken.
before, so that I can believe.
After weeks of depression, his companions managed to coax him back into action, and Alexander conducted a brief expedition against the Kossians, a small mountain tribe that was quickly overwhelmed. This brief footnote in his career would prove to be his last military action.
Okay.
He marched his army to Babylon, where he planned
campaign.
to oversee preparations for the next campaign. En route, he experienced several grim omens. A group of Chaldean philosophers begged him not to enter the city, prophesying that he would die if he did. Crows had fallen dead at his feet while he walked, and when he was sailing the marshes around Babylon, a branch caught his diadem, leaving him crownless. Most ominously of all for Alexander and his companions, after they had been exercising and Alexander returned to the throne room, he found a strange man sitting on the throne in full royal regalia. When the man was questioned, he simply replied that he had done so because the gods commanded him.
That's weird.
We leave Alexander on this ominous note, but we will return to our story soon. So make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see it.
And I hope you are subscribed and you've hit the bell icon to their channel. If you haven't, go head over to their links in the description box down below. If you enjoyed my reaction, looking forward to future reactions, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I will catch you in the next video.